Answer this before you call it wisdom. Are you protecting what God entrusted to you, or are you obeying the fear that says every open hand will leave you abandoned? Groceries cost more, bills feel heavier, caution may be necessary, and there is no holiness in pretending real strain is not real. Bankrate's 2024 finding reported that 47% of U.S. adults said money negatively affected their mental health, with inflation and rising prices named as the top reason. And this is not an abstract economy chart. This is the moment a person checks a grocery total and feels their chest tighten before the card even declines. Pew's 2024 finding also named inflation as a top national concern. In plain language, the ache in your budget is not imaginary, and the caution in your planning is not automatically sin. Stay with this. The Bible does not treat caution and fear as the same spirit. Prudence stores oil for tomorrow. Scarcity, fear, turns tomorrow into a god. Prudence asks, what does faithfulness require with what I have? Fear asks, how do I make sure I never feel exposed again? That is the first dividing line. Wisdom can close the pantry for a reason. It preserves food for responsibility, for rent, for children, for debt, for the ordinary duties God has actually placed in your hands. The scarcity fear locks the pantry beside an open table, then calls the lock obedience. It looks at the neighbor, the offering, the need, the small act of trust, and says, if I do not hold the key, no one will be fed. Now slow the question down. The issue is not whether saving is holy or giving is holy. The issue is whether fear has begun interpreting every possible act of trust as danger. That is when money becomes more than a tool. It becomes a private alarm system. It starts treating God, neighbor, and obedience as competitors for survival. Prudence protects responsibility. Scarcity, fear, builds an altar to self-protection. And the first wound is not that money is tight. The first wound is that trust begins to feel like exposure before anything has actually been lost. No wonder this feels confusing. Wisdom and fear use almost the same words. Bills, children, future, emergency, provision, rent, groceries, stewardship. But they do not carry the same weight. Think of a scale with two identical labels on it. One side is loaded with responsibility. The other is loaded with dread. From a distance, the labels look the same. Up close, the balance tells the truth. Proverbs 21:20 and Proverbs 6:6-8 are doing that work here. The wise store precious treasure and oil. The ant prepares food in summer. So, the Bible is not rebuking the person who keeps the lights on, pays the bill on time, or plans for winter. It is confronting the moment planning stops serving obedience and starts replacing trust. The issue is not whether you are allowed to be careful. The issue is what your carefulness has started to worship. And here is where the imitation becomes dangerous. One sign is when you delay every act of generosity until life feels perfectly safe. Another is when you call every vulnerability irresponsible, as if open hands are always reckless hands. A third is quieter, but it cuts deeper. You begin to resent every need that interrupts your control. A child needs something, a neighbor asks, an offering appears. A small act of faith is asked of you. And inside, something tightens. That tightening can sound very mature. It can sound like discernment. It can sound like stewardship. It can even sound spiritual. But the scale still has to be read honestly. On one side, prudence says, I am preserving what has been entrusted to me. On the other, scarcity fear says, I cannot risk being interrupted because interruption feels like loss. Those are not the same voice, even when they borrow the same vocabulary. Stay with this for a moment. The problem is not that you want to survive. Survival is a real concern, and the Bible never shames the person living under pressure. The problem comes when survival becomes the voice that defines God. When it starts telling you that every open hand is foolish, every need is dangerous, and every call to trust is a threat, then fear has dressed itself in the clothes of wisdom. That is the counterfeit. Not obvious panic, not chaos. Sometimes it is calm, careful, and organized. Fear does not always sound panicked. Sometimes it sounds mature, careful, and spiritually reasonable. So lay the evidence out, not as theory, but as testimony. A bowl of manna, a flour jar, an uncut field edge, 2 copper coins, 4 small objects, each one speaking against fear's claim that openness must wait for abundance. Do not rush past the objects. Start with the bowl. In Exodus 16:13-21, Israel is in the wilderness. Evening quail comes, morning manna appears. The measure is not vague emotion, but an omer per person, gathered daily, close enough to touch, count, and carry. Those who gathered much had nothing left over. Those who gathered little had no lack. But when the manna was hoarded beyond the command, by morning it bred worms and stank. The extra pile did not become extra piece. It became the place where decay showed up. Stay with this. The point is not that storing is always wrong. We already saw that Scripture honors wise preparation. The point is sharper than that. In the wilderness, provision was being turned into control, and control was being treated as safety. But God left worms in the hidden pile, as if to say, this is what fear does when it tries to preserve life without trust. Now the flour jar. In 1 Kings 17, verses 8-16, the place is Zarephath. Elijah meets a widow at the city gate, and she is gathering sticks, not managing abundance, not choosing between luxuries. She has a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. That is the sentence famine has written over her house. One small meal, and then the end. Then the promise comes into that exact place. The jar of flour will not be spent. The jug of oil will not run dry until rain returns upon the earth. This is not exploitation of the poor. This is provision, entering the very sentence where famine had already written the ending. Now make it smaller. The Bible is not using this woman to shame everyone who feels afraid. It is showing that God can meet obedience at the point where the household math has already declared defeat. The jar is not full when trust is required. The jug is not overflowing when the word arrives. Scarcity says, nothing can open until everything is secure. The text says, God can enter before everything is secure. Then comes the uncut field edge, Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, and Deuteronomy 24, verses 19-22. Do not speak in vague kindness. They speak in grain field edges, vineyard gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and olive branches. The owner is not told to strip the field clean and then become generous once every risk has disappeared. The field itself must carry an open edge, and the memory underneath the command is Egypt. Israel is told to remember slavery in Egypt, not as a sentimental line, but as a governing restraint. You were once vulnerable, so do not build a field system that makes the vulnerable vanish. God built open edges into the field before the owner could pretend uncertainty was gone. Let that land. The edge testifies against a private religion of total control. It says that stewardship is not only what you keep from waste, it is also what you refuse to close off from mercy. Fear wants every corner harvested, every branch emptied, every forgotten sheaf retrieved, because fear calls any unclaimed margin a danger. But the law gives that margin a different name, obedience. Now, the 2 copper coins. In Mark 12, verses 41-44, Jesus sits opposite the Jerusalem temple treasury. Rich people put in large sums. Then a poor widow places 2 small coins. The objects are small enough to dismiss, yet Jesus does not dismiss them. He says she has put in more than those giving from abundance, because she gave out of her poverty all she had to live on. But hold the tension carefully. The surrounding context warns against religious leaders who devour widows' houses, so this cannot be twisted into a tool for manipulating the vulnerable. Jesus sees trust without baptizing religious misuse. That distinction matters. He does not praise a system because it can receive her coins. He notices a heart that heaven refuses to overlook. The coins do not prove that poverty is holy by itself. They prove that God can see trust even when the world only sees an amount too small to matter. And then, Macedonia. In 20 Corinthians 8, 1-5, Paul names Macedonia severe affliction, extreme poverty, abundance of joy, and voluntary giving beyond expected ability. Those words do not belong together in normal accounting. Affliction should close the hand. Poverty should silence the impulse to give. Yet grace appears under pressure, not as surplus after comfort returns. This is not prosperity theater. It is not a promise that every hard gift will instantly return as visible increase. It is evidence that the Spirit can make generosity possible before conditions feel safe. So, the case table is now full. Manna that rotted when hoarded. A jar and jug sustained in famine. A field commanded to keep open edges. 2 coins seen by Christ. Macedonia giving under affliction and poverty. Each object refuses the same lie. Fear says, wait until there is no risk. Scripture keeps answering that faithfulness is often measured while risk is still present. Not recklessness, not manipulation, not neglect of responsibility, just obedience that refuses to let dread define God, neighbor, and the next required act. The Bible keeps placing generosity in rooms where safety looks incomplete, because that is where fear is easiest to mistake for truth. The evidence does not end at the case table. It moves inward, to a smaller throne built out of receipts, forecasts, and unopened envelopes. None of those papers are evil. A receipt can tell the truth. A forecast can help you prepare. An envelope can remind you of responsibility. But useful papers become a ruling seat when fear is allowed to sit there. That is the mental leap. Scarcity becomes spiritually dangerous when it stops saying prepare wisely and starts saying God cannot be trusted with an exposed place. It no longer protects responsibility. It begins to interpret God, neighbor, and obedience as competitors for survival. Now bring it back to your own table. In Matthew 6, 25-34, Jesus does not speak as if human needs are imaginary. He names food. He names drink. He names the body. He names clothing. He points to the birds, to the lilies, to the grass. He names tomorrow. The passage is not floating above hunger, bills, bodies, fabric, and time. It presses directly into them. Jesus does not shame the person who needs bread. He confronts the anxiety that makes bread the throne. That difference is everything. Bread belongs on the table, not on the throne. Clothing is meant for the body, never to decide whether God is present. A forecast can guide your planning, but it must never become a private prophet convincing you that obedience is unsafe. Hold on to this. Now, bring the objects back into view. The manna revealed the control hoarded through fear. The extra pile did not bring extra peace. It became the place where decay took hold. The flour jar in Zarephath showed that famine's end was not what it seemed. A handful of flour and a little oil were not the final answer, because provision arrived even before the rain returned. The edge of the field revealed another truth. Grain field edges, vineyard gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and olive branches all showed that generosity does not wait for absolute certainty. The edge remained open while risk was still present, and the widow's coins revealed an even deeper tension. Jesus saw trust in her 2 lepta without excusing the misuse of religion surrounding her. He did not confuse human failure with God's blindness. So Matthew 6 is not telling you to be reckless. It's asking you to recognize who truly rules. When information is a receipt, it serves wisdom. When a receipt becomes a throne, it trains your soul to bow. When an unopened envelope is a responsibility, it deserves attention. But when it turns into a verdict on God's care, fear has started preaching. Here's the key sentence. If obedience always feels dangerous before money runs out, scarcity has moved from circumstance into lordship. The question no longer is, can I afford this? It runs deeper. Who gets to define safety inside me? This isn't a call for reckless giving. It's not a test of financial success, nor public spirituality disguised as bravery. It's smaller than that, and more honest. The image is the unharvested edge of a field, small, intentional, costly enough to require trust, but not reckless enough to disregard responsibility. The whole field is not abandoned. Household is not mocked. The work is not treated as unspiritual. Yet one edge remains open. For context, an open edge isn't the whole field. It's the part fear wants erased first. So here's the quiet confession. Does your planning still leave room for obedience? Or does every plan close your hand before God can speak? Does caution still allow compassion? Or is compassion the first thing you cut when life feels tight? Can giving be guided by prayer, wisdom, and counsel? Or does panic take over before the question is even asked? One last question. What is the one edge fear keeps telling you to strip clean? Not the whole field, not a grand gesture, not an amount chosen to impress anyone. Just the edge where scarcity keeps whispering, if you leave that open, you will be abandoned. Maybe the first act of freedom isn't a dramatic gift, but one protected edge where fear no longer gets the final word. Trust can hold that edge, even under strain.